Welcome to another deep dive. This time, it's all about young adult fantasy. You've given us a ton of articles, videos, I even see some handwritten notes in here. Clearly, you really want to get to the heart of this whole YA fantasy thing.
Yeah, it seems like so many people just lump all YA fantasy together, but it's really more complicated than that, isn't it?
Well, that's what we're here to find out. And speaking of complicated, one thing that your sources kept bringing up was the impact of, a certain boy wizard who lived under some stairs. It's like you
Well,
can't talk about YA fantasy without mentioning Harry Potter.
that's true. It's pretty amazing how Harry Potter took over the world back in the late 90s. And it wasn't just kids reading it either.
Oh, yeah, I remember adults going crazy for those books, too.
Totally. In fact, one source even mentioned how those book releases were like Black Friday. They had security details and everything to handle the crowds.
Wow, people were really going all out for their Harry Potter fix. So what was it about those books that made them such a phenomenon?
Well, the sources pointed to a few things. I mean, first, the world that J.K. Rowling created was just so rich and detailed. It sucked everyone in. And beyond that, the story had these universal themes, like good versus evil and the power of friendship, stuff that everyone can relate to.
It sounds like Harry Potter really struck a chord at the perfect time.
Yeah. And then, of course, the publishing world went kind of nuts. Everyone was scrambling to find the next Harry Potter.
Right, I remember seeing all these older fantasy series suddenly getting repackaged to look like Harry Potter. It was kind of funny.
Oh, yeah. And then there was this flood of brand new YA fantasy books, too.
So it's like we're living in the aftermath of the Harry Potter explosion.
In a way, yeah. And in that time, YA fantasy has evolved a lot. The sources mention how YA, just like its readers, kind of grew up. It's not just about simple kid-friendly themes anymore.
That makes sense. Teenagers have to deal with some pretty tough stuff these days.
Right. So think about early 2000s YA fantasy. Stuff like Percy Jackson. It was all pretty safe. PG or PG-13 at most.
Yeah, I get it.
But then around 2010, things started shifting. Suddenly you saw books dealing with darker stuff, more mature themes, sexuality, even drug use started showing up.
Wow, that's a big change. Is that a good thing? Or has YA fantasy lost its innocence?
That's a good question, and it's something we'll definitely dig into more later.
Okay, looking forward to that. But first, there's another trend from your sources that we have to talk about.
Oh, yeah, and what's that?
It's the strong female protagonist. It feels like every other YA fantasy book now has a young woman fighting evil, saving the world.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely a trend.
Is it a good thing, a bad thing, or somewhere in between?
I think it's a bit of both, to be honest.
No, so.
Well, on one hand, publishers realize that strong female leads sell books. Look at the success of Twilight or The Hunger Games.
So it's partly about money then.
Sure, that's a part of it. But it's not just that. Representation matters.
Mhm.
For young women to see themselves as the hero, as the leader, that's a powerful thing.
You're right. It's not just about who's buying the book. It's about who's seeing themselves reflected in the story.
Exactly. It's giving young women a chance to see themselves in these amazing roles, not just as the damsel in distress. But your sources also point out some criticisms of YA fantasy, despite all the progress it's made.
Oh, yeah. I definitely noticed some of those criticisms. It seems like, despite its evolution, YA fantasy still has some limitations, especially in the mainstream.
That's right. They talked about three main limitations: characters, themes, and even the writing style itself.
Okay, let's unpack all of that. Starting with characters. What's holding YA fantasy characters back?
Well, one argument is that even when authors try to create these edgy or dark characters, they don't always go all the way. Like, there's a limit to how morally gray they can be.
So even when they try to be greedy, it's still kind of toned down.
Yeah, exactly. Like, they might make bad choices, but there's always this push for redemption, even for characters who do some really messed up things.
So even the bad guys have to be somewhat likable.
It often feels that way.
Yeah.
One source even used Glauca from the Malazan Book of the Fallen as an example. He's the soldier who does some truly horrific things, but he's still a compelling, even sympathetic character. And the source was basically saying, could a character like that ever exist in mainstream YA? Like, is YA ready for that level of moral ambiguity?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, does that reluctance to really go dark with characters, does that come from the authors, the publishers, or maybe even from the readers themselves? Like, are we all just not ready for YA characters to be truly complex?
It's probably a mix of all of that.
Yeah.
But it leads to the second limitation they brought up, which is with themes.
Okay, so what about themes?
The argument is that YA fantasy, even when dealing with dark events, it doesn't always fully explore those themes in a deep or meaningful way.
So it's not just about having characters experience trauma or loss. It's about really digging into what those experiences mean.
Right. Like one source mentioned the book Scythe, which deals with immortality and a world where death is controlled. The source felt like the book had such potential to explore these big ideas, but ultimately didn't really go there.
I get that. It's like they set up these amazing concepts and then just kind of scratch the surface.
Exactly. And that brings us to their most controversial critique, which is about the writing itself.
Ooh, okay. I'm intrigued. What's wrong with how YA fantasy is written?
Well, one source argued that a lot of mainstream YA fantasy, even when tackling mature themes, it's still written in this really simplistic, almost dumbed-down way.
That's a bold statement. I mean, aren't there plenty of YA fantasy books out there with beautiful writing?
Absolutely. The
Yeah.
sources acknowledge that there are exceptions, but they make the point that a lot of the mainstream stuff, especially what gets all the marketing, it leans towards a more accessible, even formulaic style.
So it's not that all YA fantasy is badly written, but there's this trend towards simplifying things.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, is it because they're trying to appeal to the widest possible audience? But does that mean we have to sacrifice good writing?
That's a really good point. Like, does catering to a mass audience automatically mean you have to dumb things down?
It's a tough question. But before we dive into that too deeply, there's one more big topic we need to address. It's something your sources were pretty passionate about.
Well, let me guess, romance.
Yep, you got it. That whole will they, won't they dynamic that seems to be in every other YA fantasy book. So yeah, where were we? Right, romance and YA fantasy. Your sources really had a lot to say about that. It's like there's this unwritten rule that every chosen one needs a love interest.
It's true. It's almost like, what's a fantasy adventure without a little bit of kissing, right? But I get what you're saying. Sometimes it feels so forced.
Yes, sometimes it feels like they're just going through the motions, just checking boxes, no real chemistry, no depth.
Right. And YA is supposed to be all about exploring relationships, right? First loves, heartbreak, all that.
Exactly. But I think there's so much potential to go beyond these basic tropes, like what makes a connection truly meaningful, you know?
I like that. So are there YA fantasy books that do relationships well? Like that show us something different?
For sure. Even in mainstream YA, there are authors trying to do something new, like Maggie Stiefvater, for example. Her Raven Cycle series. Those books are full of great relationships, both romantic and platonic.
Oh, I've heard good things about those books.
Yeah, they're really well done. And the sources even mentioned how Stiefvater weaves those relationships into the plot so well. It's not just like, oh, here's a love story and here's the main plot. They're connected. You know, they're driving the story forward.
That makes a big difference. It's like the romance is part of the journey, not just some side thing that happens.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us back to something we talked about earlier, that tension between accessibility and depth. Like, how do you create a book that appeals to a lot of people but doesn't shy away from the tough stuff?
It's a tough balance, right? I mean, as a reader, you want a book that's exciting and pulls you in, but you also don't want it to be all fluff, you know?
Totally. And your sources made the point that sometimes in trying to make YA fantasy super appealing, some authors end up oversimplifying things, both the writing style and the themes.
Like they're afraid to make the reader feel something or to make them think too hard.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
They pointed out how some YA books just seem to avoid really dealing with difficult stuff.
Yeah.
Like they might mention things like trauma or loss, but they don't really explore them in a deep way.
But those are things that teenagers deal with. It feels weird to pretend like those things don't exist, right?
That's what your sources were saying. It's like YA readers can handle it. They're smarter and more capable than people give them credit for.
I agree with that. So how do we fix it? How do we get YA fantasy that's exciting A&D makes you think?
That's the big question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. Your sources did have some ideas. One thing they emphasized was character development.
Makes sense. I mean, no matter how crazy the plot is, you have to care about the characters, right?
Right. The characters have to feel real. They need flaws. They need to make mistakes, struggle with stuff.
They have to feel relatable even if their lives are anything but ordinary.
Exactly. And another thing the sources stressed was being brave enough to explore the themes that matter. Don't shy away from the tough stuff, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
Yeah, like teenagers deal with real-world problems. Their book should reflect that, right?
Exactly. And then, when it comes to the writing itself, Your sources said that YA fantasy shouldn't be afraid to use sophisticated
It's
language.
like, don't underestimate your audience.
Exactly. YA readers can handle it. In fact, a lot of them probably crave it.
So maybe it's about a change in attitude, both from authors and from publishers. Stop thinking that YA has to be super simple and start trusting that readers are ready for more.
Totally. And that doesn't mean we have to throw away all the fun stuff, the magic, the adventure, all of that. It's about realizing that those things can exist alongside depth and complexity.
Yeah, like you can have dragons and magic systems A&D still make us think about real issues, right?
Exactly. And for you, as a fan of YA fantasy, maybe the biggest takeaway is this. Don't settle for mediocre books.
Don't be afraid to look beyond the bestsellers and find those hidden gems.
Right. Explore different authors, different voices. Be open to trying new
Well, I
things.
like that. It's like we're giving our listener a treasure map, but where should they start looking? There are so many YA fantasy books out there.
Don't worry, we've got you covered. In part 3, we're going to dive into some specific recommendations, books that really embody what we've been talking about.
Okay, I am officially ready for some book recommendations. Bring it on. All right, let's get to those book recommendations. After all that talk about what makes YA fantasy great, I'm ready to add some new titles to my reading list.
I hear you. And don't worry, your sources provided some amazing suggestions. Remember how much we talked about the frustration with romance in YA?
Yeah, how sometimes it just feels forced, like it's there just because it's supposed to be there.
Right. But the good news is there are books out there that do romance really well. One that kept coming up was The Winner's Curse by Marie Rutkowski.
Ooh, I've heard of that one.
It's a fantasy with this really interesting political element to it. And the romance is like a slow burn. It develops naturally as the story goes on.
I like that. Slow burn is always better than insta-love, right?
Totally. And it shows that romance can actually add to a story. In The Winner's Curse, the romance makes the politics even more interesting, and it helps us understand the characters better.
Okay, that one is officially going on my TBR list. But what about those other criticisms we talked about, like how some YA fantasy shies away from morally gray characters? Are there any books that break that mold?
Oh, yeah, for sure. One that your sources loved was The Young Elites by Marie Lu. Have you heard of that one?
I think so, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay, well, the main character, Adelina, she's really something else. She's not your typical hero. She's got this darkness to her, and she makes some pretty tough choices.
I love characters like that, the ones who make you question what's right and wrong.
Exactly. And the book really digs into that. It explores themes of power and ambition and what happens when you're pushed to your limits. It doesn't give you easy answers.
It's intense. I'll have to check that one out. But we can't forget about diversity, right? Are there any books that showcase different cultures and perspectives?
Absolutely. Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. This book is amazing. It's set in Nigeria, and it blends fantasy with real-world issues like colonialism and racism.
Wow, that's really cool. It's like using fantasy to talk about important things that are happening in the real world.
Exactly. And Okorafor does it so well. The story is captivating, but it also makes you think about things in a new way.
Okay, so we've got romance, complex characters, diverse voices, and challenging themes. What about that last criticism, the one about writing style? Are there books that prove YA fantasy can be beautifully written? A&D still be popular?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And actually, one of the books we already mentioned fits that perfectly, The Raven Cycle.
Oh, the one by Maggie Stiefvater.
Yep. That series is just so well written. It's atmospheric, lyrical. You really feel like you're in that world.
Like you're not just reading the story, you're experiencing it.
Right. It's proof that YA fantasy can be both entertaining, A&D, beautifully crafted.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely hope for those of us who want it all.
So it seems like the key to finding truly great YA fantasy is to be willing to look beyond the most hyped up books, right? To explore a little and find those authors who are doing something different.
I think so, yeah. Don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone. Try books by authors from different backgrounds with different perspectives. You might be surprised by what you discover.
It's like an adventure in itself. Okay, well, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about, and hopefully a few new books to add to their TBR pile.
Definitely.
So until next time, keep reading, keep exploring, and keep believing in the power of stories.
Couldn't have said it better myself.